CCLP, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Colorado Center on Law and Policy releases the State of Working Colorado report to gauge how the economy is performing for workers across the economic spectrum. This year's report will show why Colorado's economy wasn't working for everyone before and after the COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to thank our presenting sponsors for the event. Lowry Parity Labsac, attorneys at law, they're our presenting sponsors. Thank you for your support. And our supporting sponsors, CWE, or Center for Work, Education, and Employment, and the League of Women Voters of Colorado. Thank you so much for making this possible and all that you do to support our work here at CCLP. This presentation will be hosted by Charlie Brennan. Charlie is the Deputy Director of Research for CCLP. He's been with us for nearly 2 years now, and he compiled and authored the State of Working Colorado report, which should be published soon. You can read more about Charlie and CCLP's work on our website at cclponline.org. Having previewed this particular preview, I can tell you there will be a lot of useful information in this webinar, a lot of surprising information in this webinar, and I'm sure many of you will have questions throughout the presentation. So we'll leave about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. You can submit your questions through the chat feature or the Q&A feature on your Zoom dashboard, and I will read them aloud to Charlie at the end of the presentation. I would ask everyone to please put your names in the chat or the Q&A so I can identify who you are when I read out the questions. Sometimes it's hard to tell with the email address. And we'll have some closing thoughts and kind of wind it up. With that, I'll turn the presentation over to Charlie. Good morning, Charlie.
Good morning, Bob. Thank you for that introduction. Before we dive into the findings of the report, I just wanted to go over quickly about what's new in this edition of the report. Bob mentioned a little bit about what previous editions of State of Work in Colorado have included. That hasn't changed. What has is that we have included in this version or this edition of the report a lot more disaggregated data when that data is available to be able to show and understand better how the economy has been performing, not just at a statewide level, but then also at for different demographic groups, so different racial and ethnic groups, at the county regional level, at different parts of the state, as well as for their urban and rural parts of the state. And then, as Bob mentioned, we're also including not just data from 2018, which, as you might expect, the story that you can tell just by looking at 2018 data is very different from our current economic situation today as a state. And so we thought it was important to provide both, that look back at 2018 as well as sort of a more current picture of economic conditions in our state. So with that, we'll dive into the presentation, starting first with a look at Colorado before COVID-19. So in this section of the presentation, we'll mostly be talking about data for Colorado up and until 2018. So let's first start with employment. We can see from this chart that non-farm jobs in the state have recovered from the losses we experienced during and following the Great Recession. We returned to pre-recession levels of employment sometime in 2014 and have continued to see job growth since. One interesting trend you can see from this chart of employment is that employment losses continue following the official end of a recession. So we've got the 2001 and the Great Recession shown here as those shaded pink bars on the chart. And you can see that job losses continue to occur even following the end, and that positive job growth didn't return to the state for a couple months following the official end of a recession. So where are Coloradans employed, in what sectors of the economy? The government and public administration sector of the economy employed the most Coloradans in 2018. This was followed by the healthcare and social assistance, accommodation and food services, and the retail trade sectors. Together, these four sectors accounted for nearly half of all employment in Colorado in 2018. These sectors were also the sectors that grew the most following the Great Recession. So of the nearly 500,000 jobs that we saw added to our economy between 2010 and 2018, 43% of those were in these four sectors alone. Geographically, the majority of Colorado's jobs are located in urban counties. In total, in 2018, just 12.2% of all jobs were located in rural counties in the state. In terms of job growth, which we can see rates of annual job growth here on the map, those rates varied by county in different parts of the state. Not all counties experienced employment growth between 2010 and 2018, which we can see in those red counties. Those represent counties that saw losses in employment following the Great Recession. Of all the jobs added over this period, so the period between 2010 and 2018, 63.2% of those jobs were located in the Denver metro region alone. So that's number 5 on the map, just highlighting the important role that this region plays in our state's economy. Despite our strong economy, there are still unemployed Coloradans in the state in 2018. While Colorado's unemployment rate was lower than it was for the United States over the past 30 years, both tend to follow the same trends, rising and falling together. In 2018, the unemployment rate in our state was 3.3%, which was slightly higher than it was the previous year, but still was at levels that we hadn't seen since the 1990s and early 2000s. Not all Coloradans experience the same rates of unemployment. There are differences based on worker characteristics and geography when we look at unemployment rates. This is no less the case for racial and ethnic groups in the state. While the data shown in this chart has been averaged, represents a 3-year moving average, it does show that there has been a noticeable difference between the unemployment rates experienced by white Coloradans and Coloradans of color throughout most of the past 20 years. The unemployment rate for white workers was below the statewide rate for almost all of this period. And while not exactly the same, they do follow each other very closely and much more closely than the unemployment rates for other racial or ethnic groups in the state. So when we talk about the statewide unemployment rate, inadvertently, we're more or less talking about the unemployment rate experienced by white workers. This is largely due to the fact that white workers make up such a large share of our state's workforce. It's about 70% of the workforce in 2018 was white. But it's important to remember that this trend holds true for many of the statewide employment and unemployment statistics that we see, and that they're most likely an more accurate reflection of the conditions facing white workers than workers of color. That said, the unemployment rate for all races appears to have dropped since its peak during the Great Recession, and are converging, and the difference between unemployment rates we can see getting much smaller for different racial and ethnic groups in the state. So how did our state's economic growth translate to workers? One way to answer this question is to look at wages and income earned by Coloradans. Here we see that the median wage, which is the wage at which half of the state of wage earners in the state earned more than and half earned less than, in 2018 was about $20.37 per hour. So this meant that in 2018, half of the state's population that earned a wage earned less than $20.37 per hour, and half earned more. However, we can see that since 2000, when we adjust for inflation, that the median wage really hasn't changed at all in the past 20 years, and is only a few cents higher in 2018 than it was in 2000. This was despite our state's strong economic growth. It appears as though workers haven't necessarily seen the benefits of all that strong growth, at least when we look at the median. Workers' wages also vary by the sector in which workers are employed. At the top of the spectrum, workers in the management of companies and enterprises sector earn the most at $2,616 per week. Now, that sector employed just 1.5% of Colorado's workforce in 2018. On the other hand, the average accommodation and food service sector worker earned the least amount in the state at $451 per week. I'll also draw your attention, thinking back a couple slides to the largest sectors in terms of employment in our state, we can see that all 4 of them are below the statewide average wage, weekly wage, that is. So government, healthcare and social assistance, retail trade, and the accommodation and food services sector all had average weekly wages below the statewide average. Wages are just one source of income for Colorado households. In 2018, over 75% of the $209.4 billion earned by Coloradans came from wages or salaries. That wasn't the only source of income. The remaining 25% or so came from 7 other sources. At least these are the sources that are tracked by the Census Bureau. The largest of these sources was interest, dividends, and rental income. So income from investments in the stock market or real estate. We can see at the other end of the spectrum, public assistance income accounted for a very tiny fraction of all the income earned in our state in 2018. It was 0.1%. And even including other government sources of income, the majority of folks do rely on work to get by, to earn wages to support themselves. In 2018, Colorado's average household income was $96,218. So what this means is that if we took the $209.4 billion of income earned in the state in 2018 and divided it equally among all households, which is what an average is, each household would have received over $96,000 in 2018. I say this to make the point that ending poverty is not a question of resources. We actually have more than enough income to go around for everyone when we look at the average. The question really is how these resources are distributed versus how they should be distributed. So we can see that this chart shows how income was actually distributed among households in 2018. Just 3.5% of the total income earned in our state in 2018 went to the poorest 20% of households by income, whereas the richest 5% of households by income earned 21.6% of the total income in our state. Over half of the income earned in our state went to the top richest 20% of households in 2018. This distribution has remained more or less unchanged since 2010. So that was a brief look at COVID, or Colorado's economy before COVID. We have a lot more information that I was able to share in this short time, included in the report. So I encourage you to go back and look at the report once it's released to get a lot more detailed information about the state of our economy in 2018. But I hope that was a good enticement to go back and look at the report once it's released. So now let's turn to Colorado after COVID-19. And so for this period, we're primarily looking at the state of Colorado's economy during 2020. So starting in January or February, depending on the statistic, and running up to about September or October, which is the months for which we had the most recent economic data in most cases. Just wanted to show the long-term employment trends really quickly, just to give a sense of the magnitude of the impacts that we felt as a result of the stay-at-home order and the resulting business closures and job losses as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see a tremendous drop-off in a very short period of time, which is very uncharacteristic when we look back at past economic recessions. Just taking another look at some of the month-to-month changes in employment that we've seen since January 2020. We can see that over 300,000 jobs were lost in our state during March and April. This was with the majority of losses occurring in April. That's when, if you remember back to then, it seems a long time ago now, but that was the point at which the governor issued a stay-at-home order for the state. May and June, on the other hand, saw record-setting levels of job growth. This was the period when the stay-at-home order expired and businesses began reopening. Troublingly, we haven't necessarily seen the same level or strength of job growth as we did in May and June in the following months. So over the summer, we sort of had seen a slowdown in job growth. It's sort of been variable month to month. And I think this points to the fear that many economists have, which is that there's only a certain level of recovery that's possible given the current restrictions on our state in terms of the public health orders and those restrictions on economic activity in our state. Again, many folks believe that, including myself, that a full recovery won't be possible until we are able to either drastically contain and manage the spread of COVID-19 or effectively produce and sort of have widespread adoption of a vaccine. So in total, Colorado lost 342,300 jobs between February and April. We've since regained about 217,000 jobs over the summer to October. So that's more than half of the jobs that we lost, we've regained, which is a good sign. But we still would need to gain about 125,000 jobs to return to February 2020 levels of employment. So still a ways to go in terms of economic recovery. Here's just another look at job losses and putting them relative to past economic downturns. At the outset of this crisis, many economists hoped that we would experience what's called a V-shaped recession, meaning that the losses would be fast and quick, but then the gains would also be fast and quick and look more like a letter V. This would be, instead of a U-shaped recession, which has characterized the previous 2 recessions we've experienced in the state. These are recessions in which losses, both in jobs and economic activity, occur slowly over a longer period of time, and then the recovery is slower as well. I think, we can see that, we were headed towards V-shaped recession, and it looked that way at the beginning of the summer. I say that, that's been called into question, both by the recent spread of COVID-19 in our state, in our country, as well as some of the additional public health restrictions that were put into place recently by our governor could have an impact on economic growth and our recovery. And again, if we are forced to go to a stay-at-home order again, that could happen. We could be facing what's called a double dip recession or another round of or period of job losses, which would push our recovery period out further. And so there's a lot of uncertainty as we look forward. I will say though, when we look at past economic recessions, in order to return to full employment, or at least the level of employment that existed at the start of the recession, the previous 2 took anywhere from 50 to 60 months. And so while we might hope that we're talking about recovery from this recession, in terms of months, I fear it could be more in terms of years before we return to our pre-recession levels of employment. So now let's take a look at how employment in different sectors was impacted as a result of COVID-19. Here we see a picture of employment as of February 2020. Again, the top 4 industry or sectors in terms of employment that we saw in 2018 remain the same in 2020. Now these red bars represent employment as of April 2020, with the white portions representing the jobs that had been lost between February and April, so over the months of March and April. And we can see that the accommodation food services sector saw the most losses between March and April. This includes the restaurant industry, so no surprises there. Lost about 129,000 jobs between February and April. On the other hand, not all industries saw job losses, and some actually saw job growth. One such sector was the information sector, actually saw increases in employment. So not everyone was impacted the same way. Since April, we can see that many, but not all, sectors have seen returns to growth in terms of employment. That's represented by the yellow bars on the chart. Not all have, however. We can see that the government sector continues to lose employment and is now lower in terms of its level of employment than it was in April. This was largely driven by losses in local government and state government employment, although we have seen some declines in federal government employment as well in recent months. Again, we can see that some industries that had lost jobs have now recovered, and those that hadn't lost jobs are doing even better than they were back in April. Changes in employment have also varied by wage level. So when we look at employment at different wage levels, we can see that primarily low wage jobs have been most impacted. This chart shows data that's compiled by a project called tracktherecovery.org, which is a joint project by the Harvard University, Brown University, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We can see that low wage jobs are about 18% below where they were in September, they're about 18% below where they were in January 20th as of September 24th. And this is not surprising given that the majority of losses that we saw were in the accommodation food services sector. As you'll remember from a couple slides back, workers in this sector on average were the lowest paid in the state. What this chart does suggest is that the majority of folks facing the brunt of the economic impacts of COVID-19 are our most vulnerable workers in the state, so those earning the least amount of income and wages. This is different from past recessions. During the Great Recession, we actually saw more job losses in middle wage and high wage jobs than we did in low wage jobs. And low wage jobs quickly returned and dominated much of the economic growth that we saw in the period immediately following the Great Recession. So this, slightly different in terms of who's feeling the impacts of this recession compared to previous ones. Here's a chart showing unemployment rates. Again, just wanted to include historic trends so we could see just sort of how unprecedented the increase in unemployment was. We went from a low of 2.5% in February to a high of 12.2% in April. So, a jump of almost 10 percentage points. Here are some more recent trends in terms of unemployment rates by month for 2020. We can see that, after peaking at 12.2% in April, we did see, declines. Unemployment rate dropped below 10% and starting in July. However, what's a little bit troubling here is that we can see that the rate of decline in the unemployment rate has slowed down. In fact, initial estimates for the unemployment rate that were released yesterday by the Bureau of Labor Statistics show that the unemployment rate remained unchanged between September and October. So we're still at 6.4%. Just for context, that's a level of unemployment that we haven't seen in our state since about 2013. So still relatively high when we're thinking about where we're at in terms of our recovery. So just quickly, another indicator of labor market health is that shows us a little bit more real-time changes in terms of economic conditions is the number of people filing for regular unemployment insurance claims. Again, we can see that there is an incredible spike in initial claims filed in the early weeks of the pandemic. That has since declined, but we can see that there has been a slight uptick in recent weeks. And so the last couple of weeks of October and the first weeks of November actually saw more people file initial claims than in previous weeks. Again, here's just a close-up view of some more recent trends starting in January 2020. This chart also shows initial PUA claims or pandemic unemployment assistance claims. This was an additional unemployment insurance program that was part of the CARES Act passed by Congress, and it provided unemployment insurance benefits to many categories of workers who are normally ineligible for state and unemployment insurance benefits. So this includes self-employed workers or gig economy workers. That program didn't launch in Colorado until about May, which is why those gold bars don't show up until then. But you can see, in recent weeks, again, we've seen an uptick in both initial claims and PUA initial claims. This chart shows a combination of both the number of initial claims filed for different unemployment insurance programs in the state, as well as people filing continued claims. So that means, that folks are remaining on unemployment insurance week to week. Troublingly, we can see this number, jumped up really high during the summer and began to come down, as the summer went on. However, it does appear that, in recent weeks or months, we've sort of seen a leveling off in terms of folks coming off of unemployment insurance. What is troubling again is sort of, we can see the growth of that blue bar in recent weeks. So that blue segment of the bars represents other programs, which includes the Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program. This was another federal unemployment insurance program passed as part of the CARES Act that provides an additional 13 weeks of benefits once an unemployed worker exhausts their state benefits and state extended benefits. Both the PUA and the PEUC program, I will note, expire in December. So at the end of December, these programs will go away. That was part of the CARES Act and the legislation. So unless there's a reauthorization, extension, or another stimulus program passed by Congress before then, we are looking at a large number of Coloradans potentially who will be still unemployed, either because there's no work in their area, or they're depending on unemployment insurance for income because they're unable to work, either because they're at risk of COVID-19 and dying, or some other health impact. And so we are looking at a large number of those folks being left without a source of income at the end of the year, unless more is done to provide assistance. Lastly, I'd like to take a look at some of the geographic impacts that COVID-19 has had in different parts of the state. We can see on this map here, it shows the jobs lost in each county between February and April as a share of that county's employment as of February 2020. So for instance, if a county lost is marked 17.7% on this map here, that means that they lost 17.7% of their employment by April from February. So we can see that the greatest losses were experienced in the mountain resort counties. Here, they're greatly impacted by the early end of the ski season, as well. These are counties that tend to be more tourism dependent, and so felt the greater brunt of the impacts from job losses in the accommodation and food services sector. In many of the hardest hit counties, 1 out of every 5 jobs that had existed in February was gone by April. San Miguel County had the greatest relative decline in jobs, losing 29.2% of the jobs that were there in that county in February by April. On the other hand, Yuma County, so on the Eastern Plains, which we can see largely, that region saw the least amount of impacts. Yuma County lost just 8% of their employment by April that they had in February. We can see that the employment situation looks much better as of September. Notably, a number of counties in September had more jobs than they did in February. So those would be those counties that are marked as yellow on the map. On the other hand, the mountain resort counties appear to be lagging other parts of the state in terms of job recovery. Worryingly, both Mineral County and Summit County are in worse positions now than they were in April. So in other words, they continue to lose jobs over the summer and now have actually less jobs as of September than they did even in April. So, for example, in Summit County, 1 out of every 3 jobs that existed in February is no longer there, or was no longer there as of September. So, still, lots of areas of the state feeling impacts. And I'm not 100% certain on this, but I would venture to guess that this September data doesn't include the impacts that occurred as a result of the wildfires in places like Grand County and Larimer County. Both the evacuations and the destruction that those wildfires caused likely will have additional impacts on employment in those regions. Looking at the unemployment rates for Colorado's counties this year tells a similar story to employment. And we can see that unemployment was highest in the month of April, which is shown here in the western part of the state and lower in the eastern part of the state. In April, Pitkin County had the highest unemployment rate at 23.6%. Compared to just 2.4% unemployment rate in Cheyenne County. So there was a tremendous range and variation of unemployment rates across the state as of April. Again, the employment situation looks much better as of September. Unemployment rates across the state for all counties are below 10% now, so that's positive news. The highest unemployment rate was in Huerfano County at 8.3%, although we can see that there are still relatively high rates of unemployment in Summit County and Gilpin County. On the other hand, Baca County had the lowest unemployment rate at 1.8%. So again, lower rates, even lower rates of unemployment seen in the counties along the Eastern Plains. So that's all for this presentation. I just wanted to give a quick recap of some of the key takeaways, at least for myself, that I get from looking at this data, at least for Colorado after COVID-19. So sort of the trends we've seen this year. The first one that jumps out is that this recession doesn't look like past recessions. This is both in terms of, the trends in terms of employment and sort of the quickness that we've seen job losses and job gains, in terms of the industries that have been impacted, in terms of the cause isn't, some inherent misfunctioning or malfunctioning of our economy. It's an outside force that's putting, pressure on our economy. Job losses were greatest for low-wage workers, particularly in the hospitality and leisure sector. Again, different from past recessions, but also means that more of the impacts are being felt by our more vulnerable Coloradans. Unemployment insurance, particularly the expanded weekly benefits that were part of the CARES Act, which unfortunately expired at the end of July, were and still are a huge lifesaver for many Coloradans as well as our economy. Not only does unemployment insurance allow Coloradans to support themselves and their families when they lose employment, but it also helps to stimulate spending in our economy. jobs lost in some industries might not come back for a while. And so I think, it's important that we begin thinking about, what options in terms of employment are available for workers who may be displaced for a while. Again, the recovery, is very unpredictable in terms of what's going to happen. A lot of it depends on our ability to either manage the spread of COVID-19 or to control it using a vaccine or some other robust contract tracing system. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to question and answers. Thank you.
Great. Terrific information, Charlie. Lots of what I call good, bad news. And
hopefully it wasn't all bad news. There's hopefully some good snippets there, but
well, stuff that we can work on. It's good to know. It's good to know where we're at. I know that you really had to crunch this presentation, and I wanted to assure everybody out there viewing that there's much more where this came from when the full report is published. So stay tuned for that. With that, we'll start the Q&A portion of the webinar. Again, you can submit your questions through either the chat box or the Q&A feature. I'm going to kind of read them one by one. We just ask that where every time you ask a question, identify yourself by name so we can recognize you. And I'm also going to turn off the camera for a bit so I can just read them and we can focus on Charlie. Seems that we had one from Randall Loeb, who he's a good advocate out there for homelessness issues and skills to compete. Randall asked, do the rates of earnings of fully employed persons represent earning a living universal wage? Can you answer that, Charlie?
Can you just repeat that, Bob? I'm not sure I caught the whole thing.
Do the rates of earnings of fully employed persons represent earning a living universal wage?
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, I would say it does for many, but not for all. So, another report that CCLP produces regularly is our self-sufficiency standard. And that really looks at the costs or potential costs to the household of various compositions and in different parts of the state needs to spend in order to meet their basic needs. And one of the byproducts of that report that we also produce is our overlooked and undercounted report, which takes the rates of the different self-sufficiency standards for different families and compares them to the actual incomes of Coloradans. And what we found through that report is about 20% of Coloradans it's about 27% of Coloradans are, or at least were as of 2018, were actually below the self-sufficiency standard for their family type in their county, which indicates that for about a quarter of our population, that the wages that they do earn don't represent a living wage. And so it's not enough for them to cover basic needs without either cutting back in certain areas or resorting to debt or other types of loans to cover spending.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. Randall has another question. How many workers were unable to continue working because they had contracted COVID-19 and lost their jobs due to hospitalization or lack of health care? Any idea on that?
No, I'm not sure what that number is. That's a good question. I'm trying to think if the census tracked that through their pulse survey. I'm not certain, but that's a good question.
Our colleague Char Robert has a question. What are the most hopeful things you saw in the data?
So I'll talk just about the post COVID-19 period for this. I think what is or what has been nice is that, or surprising, I guess, in a good way, is that we still have continued to see record levels of job growth in our state. I think even though I mentioned or sort of characterized it as tapering off or slowing down, I think when you look at, even, a low month in terms of job growth that we've seen over the course of this year, it's still much higher than we typically see. So on average, jobs change in in the state. We gain about, or at least in the past 2 years, so 2018, 2019, the average monthly change in jobs was about 4,000. So even seeing something like 12,000 or 15,000 represents, good news in terms of economic recovery. Yeah, I think that that's probably, that there are places that have recovered, in that, that we've seen, in different parts of the state too, that employment has recovered to pre-recession levels. So not everywhere is feeling the brunt of the impacts the same. But, I guess that could go hand in hand as a pro and a con, I think, because, on the one hand, it's good that there are, it's not universally bad for everyone. On the other hand, there are a lot of folks who are still struggling. And so and it can be hard to see or understand or feel that way when you or yourself and everyone around you is doing well, to understand that there are still folks that, particularly our lowest income workers in the state, that are struggling.
Okay, we have several more questions. We got a whole flurry of them. One's from Sarah Martinez. Is there anything on the horizon that we should keep an eye out for in regards to legislation or help coming for unemployed Coloradans? That's more in the legislative sphere, but maybe you could take a crack at that.
Yeah, so I think what was really heartening to see was that, with a lack of government or federal leadership, that our state government, our governor and leadership in the legislature, we're proposing an additional stimulus program for workers in our state. So, they're talking about, I believe it was a payment of $375 to the most impacted workers in our state. I think that will, while it's not enough for sure, it's better than nothing, and so that's positive. And I think that we'll see what happens as a result of the special session that the governor called, which begins, I believe it's November 30th, so next week, or the week after Thanksgiving, I should say. And so, they're again potentially looking at some state level assistance for workers and businesses in the state, which should, absent any federal new federal stimulus or other legislation from the federal government, should provide at least, some help to unemployed folks in our state.
Our friend Don Burns has a question. The National Low Income Housing Coalition talks about the housing wage, what you have to earn on an hourly basis to afford an average 2-bedroom housing unit. Can you talk about that in comparison to some of your data about average hourly wages?
So I can't speak to it exactly. I'm not 100%, versed in what those housing wages were. My sense, and I believe this was the finding from that National Low Income Housing Coalition study, was that nowhere in the state was it possible to earn that housing wage based on the average wages paid. That, looking at counties as well as in the state as a whole. And so for sure, housing costs are a big part or a big chunk of a household's budget, and it's increasingly so. And I think we've in our past efforts, as an organization, have made affordable housing a priority for that reason, just because it's such an essential part of life for supporting yourself, but is increasingly expensive, and less and less supports available for folks who are either cost burdened or severely cost burdened as a result of high housing prices.
Great. Lori Harvey, our friend and partner, asked if Congress finally passes another stimulus package before the end of the year, how long would it take to get those who need it and affect our employment positively?
So that's a very good question that I don't have an answer to. I mean, I think part of the challenge with the previous round of stimulus payments was the way in which they did it. And I'm not entirely familiar with that, but I know that the choice to use the methods that they did to get those stimulus checks out to folks resulted in delays for many people receiving them, and many folks still haven't received them. So I guess, that all depends on the specifics of the legislation. Hopefully, they would want to, urgently get cash to folks as quickly as possible, just because, folks need it and have been waiting. A lot of people probably have been waiting for it, or, hoping for it to receive it for a while. And so those costs they've been foregoing or pushing off to later have been accruing. So I would hope that it happens as quickly as possible, but I can't predict how that will go down, if it does at all. I should say too that hopefully that assumes that there is a second stimulus package, which we all hope that there will be, but not holding my breath, at least in the short term. We'll see what happens in 2021.
Looks like we have one more question. I'd be happy to take one more before we start winding down. This is from Stephanie from Seawe. She asked, employers in essential industries, retail and healthcare, are sharing that they're having a hard time filling entry-level positions within healthcare and mid-level positions in retail. How might long-term employment in essential industries impact workers and businesses?
Can you read that again, Bob?
There's a bit of context before you get to the actual question, but it's a good question. Employers in essential industries, such as retail and healthcare, are sharing that they're having a hard time filling entry-level positions within healthcare and mid-level positions in retail. How long might long-term unemployment in essential industries impact workers and businesses? It's a big question.
Yeah, and I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I think, I think none of us are really certain, and I think that's I think what's challenging about this recession is that so much of it is dependent on our ability to manage the cause of it, which is the COVID-19 virus. And so I think depending on how quickly the recovery can happen or does happen, or how quickly we can get control of the virus or virus back under control, or more controlled than it is now, that could speed the recovery, which hopefully would mean that there was less of a potential for long-term unemployment in a lot of those industries. However, I will say, as it drags on, and as more restrictions are put in place, and it does seem likely that the impacts, particularly on small businesses, restaurants, small retailers, certainly is going to be beyond what they can survive, unfortunately. And so, what I'm sort of fearing in the next couple of months is that we'll start seeing a larger wave of business closures as small businesses sort of exhaust their available funds. The PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program funds, have run out, and so those were a source of support for a lot of small businesses, and the reason why they were able to keep their doors open and continue paying workers. And so yeah, I don't know that I fully answered that question, but it's a big one that I'm not sure I can respond to or answer completely anyway. So
well, it was a big question, and
a good one. I appreciate it.
We're sure to find that out in the weeks and, well, not weeks, months, and possibly years to come. So thanks a lot, Charlie. That was a great presentation. Very, very good questions, everyone. Before I turn the presentation over to my colleague, Bruce Barnum, he's CCLP's Development Director, I wanted to mention that we'll post this webinar and most other content from this 3-day virtual event on our YouTube channel. So if you missed part of this presentation or would like to view it again, we'll make it easy for you. With that said, I'll give the virtual podium over to Bruce. Thank you for participating, and good late morning.
Thank you, Bob. Really appreciate it. Wow, great job, Charlie. That was tremendous. Really informative, detailed presentation. I think we all learned a lot, even though I've seen you run through it a couple times before. I still picked up on a few new things. So it's really jam-packed with good information. And I think you all will join me in being really excited for the release of the State of Work in Colorado report this year. I think, especially in 2020, where there's so much uncertainty and so much that's unknown, this can be a real anchor for us in Colorado to understand the shifting nature of the workforce and unemployment And so I think it'll be tremendously valuable when it comes out soon. So thanks again, Charlie. Virtual round of applause from everybody for Charlie. Great presentation. So I'm here to both thank our sponsors for the event in its entirety. So you see our presenting sponsors in front of you right now, and in a moment you'll see our supporting sponsors as well. Just tremendous community support for this event, which we really appreciate from all of those sponsors and from all of you as attendees. I also want to remind you all that through midnight tonight, we have a special board match happening. So our board of directors, through their generosity, have rallied together and raised $10,000 for a match. So if you donate any amount to CCLP before midnight tonight, it'll be matched dollar for dollar. Additionally, if you give through the Colorado Gives platform and you schedule your donation when you give to be deposited on Colorado Gives Day, it'll actually take advantage of additional matching funds through Colorado Gives Day. So you get a double match. So definitely check out that option when you give as well. So please give to help us take advantage of the generosity of our board. We really appreciate them and what they've done for us to support this event. And let me also lastly invite you to join us at 2 p.m. Our last portion of this 3-day event. Tiffany Lennon is going to share some reflections on everything that you've seen over the last 3 days and give us some words of wisdom and inspiration to send us off into the rest of our weekend. So we'll see you all back here in just over 2 hours. And thank you very much for attending this session. Appreciate it.
Thank you.